times are changing quick. 1 year, the whole nation flips on its head. Verse 25, before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all of his heart and with all of his according to all the laws of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So it's kind of the end of Josiah. Verse 27 is, and the Lord said, I will remove Judah, Israel, I will cast off which I said, my name shall be there. So Josiah, so we have all these great things, and then the Lord's like, also just remember, there's going to be punishment coming. And to understand that phrase, removed from my sight, is kind of like hyperbole. God is using a term to communicate to them in a way that's kind of how some of those localized gods feel more like mascots, where they have power at their home base, but if they go to the team next door, they feel like they're weak. This is the same kind of thing where God's saying, I'm here and I'm going to send them away from me so I can't see them. So not that God can't see them wherever they are. He's omniscient, he's omnipresent, he can do all that, but he's removing them from their location in Israel because of their disobedience. So then Josiah through 30. And so that's kind of the end of the reign of Josiah. Now we have a bunch more kings with J names. Now we have King Jehoaz, who's going to reign. He was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. He's in 5. He is the son of Josiah, who was defeated by Egypt. Basically, Josiah was in a battle with the king of Egypt. He ended up dying. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, then comes against his son. He gives up, and he has to pay him. If you wanted to be rich right now in this economy, you would want this, because that's 3.75 tons of silver and 75 pounds of gold. That is a lot of money. And so now Judah in some way is subservient. So they're kind of like this vassal. Here, take. So that's Jehoaz. Then, which Jehoaz is weird because there's no, like, falls off, like there's nothing else. The end, he fought. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of God had done. He's in 2 Kings 20. King Nebuchadnezzar is actually going to come against him, and he took him away in what's going to be the first wave of captivity. So when you read this, there's captivity away from Babylon, and it's not until that third wave happens that Judah is gone, except for the very poorest of the poor people who are there just kind of to make sure the land doesn't become, untenable and overgrown, so it's no longer any good. So Babylon, basically what happened is Babylon comes. Babylon is going to defeat Egypt, who just defeated Israel. Babylon's then going to come to Israel. So King Nebuchadnezzar then goes and asserts himself as the ruler over those who had allegiance with Egypt. He came against Jerusalem, including the prophet Daniel, who we'll read later on. So Daniel goes. Then decides, you know what would be a good idea? I should rebel. In my Bible, I write notes, and I drew a little picture, and it's a tiny fish, and it says Israel. And then I drew a bigger fish, and it says Egypt. And then next to it, it's a bigger fish, and it says Babylon. And you just got beat up by Egypt. Why would you go fight the bigger fish of Babylon? This is not a good choice. But apparently this is going to be a running theme, because we're going to keep saying, hey, we should rebel against Babylon. It's a great idea. So he's going to rebel against Babylon. Verse 7, it says, the king of Egypt, let me read it here. And the king of Egypt did not come again out of the land, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So again, Babylon's now said, okay, you're mine. And this has started to happen where Judah is taken away in this captivity. So that's kind of Jehoiakim. Jehoiachin is the next one. Again, another really long reign of 3 months. Captivity. So Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father has done. It's amazing that we're able to get in that he was a terrible king within 3 months. We were able to decipher this out. So again, couldn't have been that great, even after all these great reforms that happened, right? Josiah, great king. Like the next generation, it lasts like a hot second, and then it falls apart again. And then you wonder why we're getting taken away into Babylon. Verse 25 or verse 12 through 25, it says basically the king surrendered along with his secretary, his official, and his palace officials, and a total of about 10,000 people are carted off in the second wave to Babylon, including the prophet Ezekiel, another prophet that we'll read his book later. This fulfilled what God had said in 1 Kings 9, 6 through 9, and the temple treasuries and the golden articles that remain in the temple were also taken. So in the 8th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, much easier to say than Jehoiachin, I don't know why, but Nebuchadnezzar is taking away this next king. And so what he does is he takes him away. Oh, I forgot. Don't look at that yet. So we have all this. Why did I do that? Sorry, people. Okay, verse 13. So he carried off all the treasuries of the temple. You can kind of see the temple here. So he's carrying off all these different artifacts of the temple. You've got the wash basins there. You've got all these gold doors on the walls. You've got the treasuries on the side here, and you have these giant bronze pillars. Gone. Well, whatever hasn't already been taken through the years, we talked about this before, where other kings have come in and kind of ransacked stuff, and they haven't been able to put it back together necessarily. And I don't think you have the wealth to do that when you're having to give the king of Egypt a ton of, 3.5 tons of silver and a ton of gold. You don't really have the resources to fix that up, but they're destroying the temple. So the second time around, Nebuchadnezzar now takes the temple. And so now we've gone from the peak in 1 Kings with the building of the temple to now the temple being burned. The temple is burned. The city is burned. There's a siege that actually happens. The wall is broken down. He's going to burn the palace. Later, he's going to come and break down more of the wall. That'll be important. Story on him trying to rebuild this wall. And again, because we decided it was a good idea to rebel against the king. So he takes him to Egypt or to Babylon, and then he takes his uncle and puts his uncle in his place. And that uncle is Zedekiah, aka Mathaniah. Mathaniah is his actual name. Babylon had this weird thing where they like to rename people, which you'll figure out when we get to Daniel, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those 3 guys that you have heard of before, that's not their names. That's their Babylonian names. So bad. It's so bad because I don't even remember what their regular names are, because we're so associated them with their names of Babylon. But that was kind of something that he did. This is 2 Kings 24, 18 through 20. He again thought it would be a good idea to rebel against Babylon, and he served as the last king of Judah before all of the nation is taken into captivity. So you have the fall of Jerusalem in chapter 25. This is going to be January 588 BC is when the fall is going to happen. So there's a siege against. See, I did mess up. This is supposed to happen now. So picture that burning temple in just a minute. Just hold it in your brain. You didn't see it. It's a magic trick. So the siege happened on ended on July 16th, 586 BC, And the king was captured. So this third king was captured. The wall was destroyed because of the siege, and Zedekiah's eyes are removed, and he's taken into captivity to Babylon. In verses 8 through 12, about 4 weeks later, everything in the city is burned. The temple, the palace, and more of the wall are destroyed, so that the inhabitants could not defend themselves, and all the rest of the people, except for the poorest, are taken to Babylon in the third wave. And so now we have this third wave happen. So this is actually when the temple gets burned down and all these other things. Again, pivotal point. We've been working this entire storyline, right? Land, people, government, back from Abraham. We got the land. We got the people. We had the government in the establishment of the kings. We had the temple, which is built after we had this tent we wandered around the wilderness for a long time with, and we got this permanent structure. We've gone from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows in an inch of paper. It's not taken very long for this nation to collapse and fall apart, which is one of the great tragedies of what goes on. So again, he takes all the artifacts from the temple. If you remember those giant bronze pillars that I showed you before, when we read through the construction of the temple, those were so heavy that they didn't even bother weighing them to figure out how much bronze was actually in them, which is a bit ridiculous when you think about the fact that we just gave the king of Egypt 3.75 tons of silver. So they must have weighed at least that, if not more so, because we didn't even bother weighing it. That's how big they were. They were so big they had their own names. They named the pillars. One of them name was Boaz. All of this is taken away. And so when we read, like in the Psalms, we've read this a couple of times ago in a different series, it says, by the rivers of Babylon we wept. And that's why. Because your nation has now dissolved to where the only thing left is a crushed wall, a burnt temple, and the poorest of the poor trying to scrap a living, as the rest of your nation is dragged off to a foreign land. So he's like, okay, well, I'm done with this. So he takes all the leaders and he executes them to stop the people from being able to unite together or try to put something together to fight against him, even though we've seen that's really pointless. And then you have not a king, but now you have a governor of the surviving kingdom, Gedaliah. It's in 2 Kings 25, 22 through 26. He's going to reign in Judah. He's going to govern over the remainder of Judah before being assassinated by pro-Egyptian Israelites. So basically what happens is there's some Israelites led by a man named Ishmael. They think they should unite again against the king of Babylon. We're really slow at learning what a good idea is. He warns them not to do that, and then he ends up getting assassinated. And then they leave because they're worried about the repercussions that what's going to happen, because when Nebuchadnezzar hears that his vice-regent, his ruler over the area has been assassinated, what is he going to do to them? So they leave and flee to Egypt. So the last people to leave are then going back to the place where we started this whole story. And then you end this story on a weird... 2 Kings ends on a weird story. It ends on something 37 years in the future. It's the story of Jehoiachin, one of those kings we talked about before. So just about halfway through the Babylonian captivity, Jehoiachin was released from prison by Nebuchadnezzar's son. The release of the Judah's king from prison is supposed to give us hope that there is still a future for Judah and for the Davidic line, and that the words of 2 Samuel 7, 15 through 16 are still true, which basically talking about how God has steadfast love for his people and that there will ultimately be a forever king, that Davidic line, right? So if what God said is true, the story can't end here. So the author gives you this little glimmer of hope that 37 years into the future, the king is released from prison. He's fed at the king's table, or at least he's given better food than what he was in prison, and he's put on minimum security, basically, and he's pulled out. So this sign that God has not forgotten them, kind of like Joseph, right? Even though Joseph was in prison for all that time, he was still elevated. It's the same kind of idea that God's promises are still true and that God will still do something with his people, even if they're in exile because of their punishment right now. And that's 2 Kings. So we end on this story, and so now we get into Another fun book, which is the book of Chronicles. Again, what we're doing in Chronicles is we're looking back at the past and we're anticipating the future. And so what I'm going to do tonight is I just want to give you a quick overview of what's happening in Chronicles. If you're following along with us, I think we're 4 chapters in today, so we're not too far. So we're going to cover some of that in next week's readings next week, but I'll give you kind of the big picture on what's going on to help you kind of track with what you're reading. So the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles covers the same time period of history, of Jewish history described in 2 Samuel through 2 Kings, but its perspective is a little bit different. And so it's going to tell, you're going to have some of the same material that you've already read, which should make it easier for you. As we've gone through all these kings, it'll be a little lighter reading because you're at least somewhat familiar with what's going on. But again, it comes from a slightly different perspective. As a modern reader, we may be tempted to look at Chronicles and say, hey, I just read all this, and then be prone to skip it. But that would be a tragic mistake. These books are not a mere repetition of the same material, but a divine editorial on the history of God's people. While Samuel and Kings are political history of Israel and Judah, Chronicles gives more of the religious focus on the Davidic dynasty of Judah. So instead of being written from a prophetic and a moral perspective, Chronicles is written from more of a priestly and a spiritual perspective. And so this is kind of the difference of, think of like a news reporter versus an opinion writer. It's the same exact content from 2 different points of view is basically what we're looking at. So you're going to get some of the same stories that you've already read, but our focus is going to be different. So we're going to highlight things that weren't in the other ones, and we're going to omit things that were in the other ones. So some of this content will be new, some of it will not. Like Samuel and Kings, Chronicles was originally one book in the Hebrew, and the title could be translated "The Events of the Times." Later, it was called "Of the Things Omitted." So again, those things that were left out maybe in those other books because of the extra content that is not in Samuel or Kings. And the final name of Chronicles comes actually from a man named Jerome when he did the first Latin translation of the Bible, which is called the Latin Vulgate, which takes place in about 385, 405 AD. So the first time you have the Bible translated into Latin, the common language of the people at that time, is by Jerome. That's where that new title of Chronicles come from. The first book of Chronicles begins with the royal David's righteous reign. The book of 2 Chronicles parallels 1st and 2 Kings, but it virtually is going to ignore the northern kingdom. It's going to focus exclusively on Judah. And possibly, again, because of the false worship of Israel and the refusal to acknowledge the temple in Jerusalem, Chronicles instead is going to focus on the zealousness for the Lord that brought about reform. So he's going to focus really on those good kings that happened. And again, all of those happened in Judah. So all of Chronicles, right, we're really looking at David and David's line. So we don't really care about the northern tribes because remember, the northern tribes are all these different dynasties knocking each other off. I think it's 9 different families that kill each other off through that time. And Judah is David all the way through. So that's really what we're tracking. So we're going to look at Asa, Jehoshaphat, Josiah, Hezekiah, and Josiah. The temple and temple worship are central throughout the book, which makes sense for a nation whose worship of their God is central to their survival. As we've seen, they fail to worship God, then they fail to be a nation. The book begins with Solomon's glorious temple and concludes with Cyrus's edict to rebuild the temple more than 400 years later. And so that's the big pieces of Chronicles. As far as the author of the book, again, the author, unfortunately, is not specifically stated in the book, but through Jewish tradition and through internal evidence, we think that it's possibly the prophet Ezra, the priest Ezra, who is the author. The contents of the book points to a priestly author, again, prophet versus priest kind of view of things, possibly because his emphasis on the temple, the priesthood, the godly line of David in the southern kingdom. The narrative itself also suggests that it was written during the time of Ezra. have genealogies. They both focus on temple worship, ministries of the priesthood, and obedience to the law of God. In addition, the closing verses of 2 Chronicles, so 2 Chronicles 36, 22, and 23, are repeated with minor changes as the opening of the book of Ezra, so Ezra 1, 1 through 3. So thus Chronicles and Ezra are kind of like two pieces of one narrative, in the same way that the book of Luke ends and then the book of Acts picks up at the same place. They're two pieces, possibly written by the same author. The date of the book, well, the content of the book covers, from Adam to post-exile. So we're covering a long span of time. So again, it starts with a genealogy, starting from David, running to Adam, and then, reverse it, running from Adam to King David, and then David to the return from the exile. And then King David, again, is going to be the focus of this period. Ezra probably completed Chronicles sometime between 450 and 430 BC and addressed it to the returning remnant. So what's going to happen is we're in Babylon. We're going to be in Babylon for 70 years. Unlike Assyria, we have a set time frame, which we'll get in some of those other books. And God basically says you're in timeout for 70 years, and then you get to come back. This book is written as an encouragement to those who are coming back. So again, we talked about if you're away for 70 years, there's a possibility, right, that you have people who have either lived through, you're only one and a half generations apart from the destruction that you saw in the temple and the city and Babylon coming against you. So this is written as an encouragement to these disheveled, disheartened people as they go back from Babylon to Jerusalem. Ezra is actually going to lead some of those exiles into Jerusalem in 457 BC and minister to the people as one of their spiritual leaders. The purpose of the book, Ezra is again written to these people who have recently returned from Babylon. Again, some might who have even been alive during this time. They are returning to a dilapidated city in a destroyed, lacking all of the splendor and grandeur of Solomon. Now in our Bibles, again, Chronicles comes after Solomon and Kings, but in Jewish tradition, Chronicles is actually your last book of your Old Testament. So if you had a Jewish Bible, Chronicles is not here. Chronicles is at the end. Why? Because Chronicles is somewhat a summary of everything that's come so far. It's going to be a summary of the entire nation of Israel. So we're doing this very quickly in the fact that we have 9 chapters of genealogy, and that's going to get us through a bunch of that. And then we're going to come to King David, kind of the high points of that, and some of those good kings. And so it's really a summation of some of the things that have come before it. There's 2 main focal points as we look at the book. The 2 main focal points are going to be the throne of David and really the temple and its restoration, the symbol that God is with his people. These are the 2 focal points of the book. So looking forward, this is where we get kind of those arrows, and it's a little difficult to describe, but Ezra is looking back at what has already happened, and he's talking to you first about that the highest point of the kingdom as far as the righteous king, King David. So again, David is that ruler by which all these other kings are graded, and then you have the temple. So Chronicles is really looking forward to the fulfillment, right, of that messianic coming king and the restored temple. So he's looking back at what has happened in history and anticipating what's going to happen in the future. To give you an idea of maybe what that feels like, when you read Revelation and you get kind of excited about things of the future, right, that you see there, because you see that God has promised a future king to come reign. There's going to be peace. There's going to be prosperity. That millennial kingdom, that thing that you're looking for, is the same thing that he's anticipating here. It's just in a different context because you have the destruction of the temple and stuff. And so he's really looking for that restored, that ultimate peace that comes because of the fulfillment of God's promises. So that's the big picture of Chronicles. I'm going to give you 4 big pieces of the 2 books. There's two per book. The first really is the royal line of David. So again, Chronicles is going to trace the whole story of Israel's history up to the return from captivity, to give the returning remnant a perspective on the developments of the past. The whole book of First Chronicles, like 2 Samuel, is dedicated to the life of David, and it's going to begin with his royal line there in chapters 1 through 9, before surveying the key events of David's reign in 10 through 29. So that royal line of David, again, is going to start with Adam. It's going to run to David, and I'll kind of give you a breakdown here on some of the big pieces of what's going on. You have Adam to Abraham. You have then Abraham to Jacob. Jacob is going to go to David in chapter 2, verses 1 through 55. Then you're going to run from King David to the captivity. So right here where we just ended our story is where that genealogy ends there at the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is going to go back. It's going to talk about the 12 tribes, and then it's going to talk about the remnant of Judah and Benjamin, because those are the 2 tribes of Judah left, right? And then it's going to end with Saul. Why is it ending with Saul? Because your focal point again is David. So we're going back and we're basically setting up the story for David at the end of chapter 9. It's also important to note that a large portion of the genealogy also has to do with the Levitical priesthood, again, tying together the 2 main themes of this coming king and the restoration of the temple, because we're going to put a lot of emphasis on the king, and we're going to put a lot of emphasis on the temple. So we have King David and the Levites, who are going to be the directors of worship, basically, for the nation. And then you're going to run into the second piece, which is the reign of King David. This is a bunch of stuff that you are familiar with and a bunch of stuff that you're not familiar with. Compared with 2 Samuel, David's life in Chronicles looks completely different, both because of what it's added and what it has omitted. Again, Chronicles does not speak about David's struggles, so he doesn't talk about him running away from Saul. It doesn't talk about a 7-year reign in Hebron before he unites the kingdom. It doesn't talk about his various wives. It doesn't talk about his rebellion with Absalom. It doesn't talk about him and Bathsheba. You've got to get all of that from reading Samuel. So again, some of this is repeat, some of it's not, and you're going to miss some of the story. You're going to miss another facet of King David's life if all you get is what you read in Samuel. Chronicles instead add events like David's preparation of the temple and its worship services, again, tying in those 2 main themes, the king and basically the priest, the temple side of it. Only 1 chapter, again, is going to be given to Saul's reign in chapter 10, because his heart is not right with God. But David's story begins with the coronation over all of Israel, as he has already reigned as king for 7 years in Judah. So remember, David runs away from Saul for a bunch of time. Saul is eventually killed. He ends up ruling the southern nations for a little bit, for 7 years, and then he becomes ruler over all. We're skipping everything before that, before he becomes ruler over all of Israel. It emphasizes his concern for the things of the Lord, including his return of the ark and his desire to build the temple. God is going to establish the critical covenant with David in chapter 17, so the repeat of the Davidic covenant. His sin in numbering the people is recorded to help teach us about the consequences of disobeying God's law. And then most of the rest of it, which is chapters 22 through 29, is concerns with David's preparation for the building of the temple and worship anticipated with it. David may not have been allowed to build the temple, but what he does is he designs the plans, he gathers the materials, he prepares the land, he arranges the Levites, the priests, the choirs, the soldiers, and the stewards. He gets everything ready. So when Solomon basically comes on the scene and says, go, they're ready to go. Everything's ready. The book closes with his public prayer of praise and the ascension of Solomon. So again, a very different story with a big focus. 22 through 29 is all about David getting that temple built as that pinnacle there. And then you have 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles is going to pick up the story right where we left off with the reign of Solomon. Again, 1 through 9. So the reign of Solomon begins the golden age of peace, prosperity, and temple worship. The kingdom is united and its boundaries extended to their greatest point. Solomon's wealth, wisdom, Solomon's wealth, wisdom, palace, and temple become legendary, and his mighty spiritual, political, and architectural feat raise Israel to its zenith. However, it is keeping with the purpose of Chronicles that 6 out of 9 of the chapters concern with the construction and dedication of the temple. Another 6 chapters just talking about worshiping God and building that temple. So again, a lot of focus on the kings, a lot of focus on the temple. And then you have the second piece, which is the reign of the kings of Judah. So again, we're going to basically ignore the whole northern nation, and we're going to focus just on Israel just on Judah and those kings. We're not going to go through most of this. We'll get to this when we get to 2 Chronicles. But basically, when you look at this, about 70% of the chapters, which is 10 through 36, deal with the 8 good kings, leaving only 30% to deal with the evil rulers. So again, we're really focusing on who's doing those reforms, who's raising the spiritual climate of the nation in a positive way. Each king is seen with respect to his relationship to the temple as the center of worship and spiritual strength. And when the kings serve Yahweh, Judah is blessed with political and economic prosperity. So that's our overview of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, what I want to do, though, is I sent you guys an email the other day, and then today I'm like, oh, I should have told them this in the email. This would have been helpful, so I'm going to tell you now. If you're reading along with us, those first 9 chapters of Chronicles are a great genealogy. And as you saw me stumble over the 10 names that I had tonight, it can be very annoying trying to say those yourself. And it can be kind of difficult. So what I wanted to do is give you guys some maybe helpful tools to help you to kind of chug through that piece as you read. One thing that you can do is you can listen along to your Bible as you read. That's one thing I did this week to kind of help me, so I can just stare at it and listen along, so I don't have to pronounce the names. I get someone else to do it for me, and I can still get through it. So 2 ways you can do that. One is YouVersion. We've talked about this before. It's just a free app. It's a Bible app. There's a bunch of different translations. Some of those have audio versions that are connected to it, so you can log into that and you can get that. That's free. There's a better one that I like, but it costs money because it's better. There's another one called Dwell. Dwell is a different app. It's $30 a year for a $30 subscription. It has several different translations, but it's just audio. That's all it is. There's no text in it. But it has several different voices that you can listen to. They've added new translations, so they have 4 in ESV, they have an NIV, they have an NKJV, they have an NRSV. So they have several different translations that they've added now. They also have background music, so you can choose ambient music. You can change kind of levels with that. You can change the play speed. So if you need to slow it down, you can slow it down. If you want to speed it up a little bit, you can speed it up. But those are just some ways to kind of help you as you read through this, because you're gonna trudge. It's not necessarily enjoyable to read all of these names, and that's partly why it's nice to have some of the Psalms and stuff and the Proverbs to read alongside of it. Because it's really hard to apply the genealogy to my life today. Sometimes when you don't look at the big picture, what's going on. So I just want to give you guys those things. If you need any more help with that, again, you can email me at mark@gulfviewgrace.org, and I'll give you some information about that. Or if you want to be connected with our reading plan, I can help you guys through that. So thank you guys. We're going to pray, and then you can go for the night and hopefully get home somewhat dry. So let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for a time to study your word. We thank you for these books in your word that help guide us, that help correct us, that help give us examples of real people who lived and how they were either successful or where they failed in following you. God, help us to learn from these different stories and these things. Help us to be people who ultimately seek after you with all of our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength. And who desire to see you made known throughout the world. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, guys.